You've heard about Ferdinand Magellan. You've heard about the Battle of Mactan. You've heard about the discovery of the Philippines. But here's what they didn't teach you in school. When Magellan arrived in the Philippines in 1521, he didn't discover an empty primitive continent. He encountered an ancient civilization that had already existed for over 5,000 years. He met sophisticated kingdoms with established trade routes that stretched across 3 continents. He found warriors, poets, scholars, traders, and rulers who had built a complex society worthy of remembering. This is the story of the Philippines before the Spanish arrived. This is the story that changed history. And this is the story that's been overlooked for far too long. Section 1. The First Filipinos, the Austronesian Journey, 3000 BCE to 1500 BCE. The Great Migration. Let's travel back 5,000 years to a time when the world was vastly different. Around 3000 BCE, in the region of Southeast Asia and the Pacific, an extraordinary migration was taking place. From the coast of Taiwan and mainland Southeast Asia, a remarkable group of seafarers embarked on one of the greatest voyages in human history. These were the Austronesians, master navigators, skilled boat builders, and fearless explorers who would ultimately populate not just the Philippines, but the entire expanse of the Pacific Ocean, from Madagascar off the coast of Africa to Easter Island in the Eastern Pacific. The Austronesians possessed something that made them unique among ancient civilizations: advanced maritime technology and an intimate knowledge of ocean navigation that modern scholars still find astonishing. They built sophisticated double-hulled outrigger canoes called barangays. These weren't simple boats. They were engineering marvels equipped with catamarans' hulls that provided stability in rough seas, and sails woven from plant fibers that could harness the power of the ocean winds. Archaeological evidence from excavations at Butuan in Mindanao has revealed that these barangays were constructed using sophisticated joinery techniques, wooden pegs instead of nails, and planking that was carefully mortised together. These vessels were capable of carrying multiple families, livestock, agricultural supplies, and trade goods across hundreds of kilometers of open ocean. Navigation without instruments. What's truly remarkable about the Austronesian migration is that these sailors navigated without compasses, without maps, without modern instruments of any kind. Instead, they possessed an intricate knowledge of the stars, the ocean swells, the behavior of birds, and the patterns of ocean currents. They understood something that Western science wouldn't fully comprehend until the age of modern oceanography. The ocean has highways. Currents, temperature patterns, and seasonal wind patterns create predictable routes across vast distances of water. The Austronesians had decoded these natural patterns through generations of careful observation, and they passed this knowledge down orally through their maritime cultures. This knowledge system, known as wayfinding, represents one of the most sophisticated, non-written navigation systems ever developed by humans. Polynesian navigators, who shared the same Austronesian heritage as the early Filipinos, would later sail across the entire Pacific Ocean using these same techniques, traveling distances of 5,000 kilometers or more with extraordinary accuracy, all without written charts or instruments. Arrival in the Philippine archipelago. By approximately 3000 BCE, waves of Austronesian migrants had reached the Philippine archipelago. They came in successive migrations, each wave of settlers bringing new technologies, new languages, and new cultural practices. These early Filipinos established themselves across the thousands of islands that make up the Philippine archipelago, from Luzon in the north to Mindanao in the south, from the western coast to the eastern shores. The earliest archaeological evidence of human habitation in the Philippines dates back even further than this Austronesian migration, to approximately 67,000 years ago, with evidence of the Pleistocene maritime adaptation, indicating that humans were capable of sea travel and island settlement even in prehistoric times. However, the large-scale settlement and the development of agricultural societies that would characterize the Philippines' pre-colonial period came with the Austronesian migrations of the Bronze Age, around 3000 to 1000 BCE. Development of agricultural society. Once established in the Philippines, these Austronesian settlers didn't remain isolated maritime peoples. They adapted to their new homeland and developed agricultural systems that would sustain the islands for millennia. Archaeological evidence shows that by 2000 BCE, agricultural settlements had been established throughout the archipelago. These early Filipinos cultivated rice in both dry and wet fields, domesticated pigs and chickens, cultivated coconut palms, and developed intricate systems of irrigation that would astound early Spanish chroniclers with their sophistication. The development of wet rice agriculture in the Philippines represented a crucial technological advancement. This wasn't simple subsistence farming. It required sophisticated knowledge of water management, soil chemistry, and seasonal patterns. Archaeological excavations in Ifugao and other regions have revealed ancient rice terraces that are astonishingly complex in their engineering, suggesting that even 3,000 years ago, Philippine societies possessed sophisticated technical knowledge. The Bronze Age transformation. By 1500 BCE, the Philippines had entered what archaeologists call the Bronze Age. This wasn't a sudden transformation, but rather a gradual process driven by increased contact with mainland Southeast Asian and Chinese civilizations. Bronze tools and weapons began to appear in Philippine archaeological sites, indicating that the island's inhabitants had begun engaging in trade networks that extended far beyond their immediate region. The presence of bronze artifacts in the Philippines, some dating back to at least 1000 BCE, reveals that early Philippine societies were not isolated. They were connected to broader trading networks that included parts of what is now China, Vietnam, and Thailand. Archaeological evidence from sites like Tondol and Lumang Batangan in Mindanao shows that early Filipinos were producing bronze weapons and implements, suggesting they either learned bronze working from external sources or were engaging in trade relationships where bronze goods were exchanged for local products. Social organization in early Filipino society. During the Bronze Age and Iron Age periods, roughly 1500 BCE to 500 CE, Philippine societies developed increasingly sophisticated forms of social organization. The archaeological record reveals evidence of specialized craft production. Archaeological sites show that by 1000 BCE, different regions of the Philippines had developed specialized craft production. Some areas became known for high-quality pottery, others for textile production, still others for metalworking. This specialization indicates a level of economic complexity that goes far beyond simple subsistence farming. Fortified settlements. Archaeological surveys have identified the remains of fortified settlements dating to this period, suggesting that organized defense and inter-community conflict management were already features of pre-colonial Philippine society. These fortifications indicate that communities had reached a level of social complexity that required organized military structures. Long-distance trade, archaeological evidence of materials from distant sources, obsidian from volcanic regions in the Pacific, shells from distant waters, and various exotic materials indicates that long-distance trade networks existed in the Philippines centuries before European contact. Goods were moving hundreds of kilometers between trading partners, suggesting established relationships and shared cultural understanding. Section 2. The rise of barangay societies, 500 CE to 1200 CE. The barangay, the foundation of Filipino society. One of the most important social units in pre-colonial Philippines was the barangay, also spelled barangay or barangay. The word itself derives from balangay, the name of the type of boat that early Austronesian settlers used to migrate to the islands. A barangay was fundamentally a settlement based around a boat-sized community, typically numbering between 30 and 100 families, sometimes larger. The barangay was not merely a geographic location, it was a complete social, economic, and political unit. Each barangay had its own chief, called a datu, or lakan depending on the region, its own laws and customs, its own economic system, and its own military organization. Multiple barangays might ally with one another for mutual defense or trade, but each retained its fundamental autonomy. The datu, chief and leader. The datu, from the Sanskrit word meaning to give, was the primary leader of the barangay, but his role wasn't simply to command. The datu was a complex figure, part warrior, part administrator, part spiritual leader. He was responsible for justice. The datu served as judge in disputes between community members, making decisions based on customary law that had been passed down through generations. Defense. The datu led the barangay's warriors in defense against external threats and in raids to gain wealth and prestige. Trade. The datu often served as the primary trader for the barangay, negotiating with other barangays and foreign merchants. Religious functions. The datu often had spiritual authority, mediating between the physical and spiritual worlds through consultation with babaylan, shamans and spiritual leaders. If you're amazed by our ancestors' story, the Philippines before Magellan, the 5,000-year civilization they don't teach in school, help us hit our 500-like goal. Drop a comment about your favorite fact and subscribe to join the Histo PH family. Land distribution. The datu managed the distribution of agricultural lands, ensuring that all families had access to resources they needed to survive. The position of datu wasn't automatically inherited. A son might succeed his father only if he demonstrated the necessary qualities of wisdom, bravery, and business acumen. If a datu's son proved incompetent, the barangay might select a different leader, often from another family. This system, while not fully democratic, created incentives for the datu to rule justly and effectively, as his position depended on community consent. The social structure of the barangay pre-colonial Philippine society developed a clear but not rigid social hierarchy. Majinu, nobility. These were the descendants of previous datus and the wealthy merchant families. They owned the best agricultural lands and controlled much of the trade. The Majinu class enjoyed significant privileges, but also bore responsibilities. Maharlika, warrior class. These were free warriors who served the Datu in battle. Warriors who showed particular bravery and skill could accumulate wealth through raiding and could eventually aspire to join the Majinu class or even become datus of new settlements. Alipin, commoners/dependents. The majority of the barangay population were Alipin, free commoners who worked as farmers, fishers, craftspeople, and laborers. Alipin were protected by the barangay's laws, but had fewer rights than the upper classes. Slaves. At the bottom of the social hierarchy were slaves, who might be war captives, debtors, or individuals born into slavery. However, slavery in pre-colonial Philippines was significantly different from later European slavery. Slaves could own property, could marry free persons, and their children were not automatically born into slavery. The barangay economy. The economic system of the barangay was sophisticated and complex, involving agriculture, rice farming, particularly wet rice agriculture, formed the foundation of the barangay economy. The Datu controlled irrigation systems and the distribution of agricultural lands, making him essentially a landlord. Fishing. In coastal barangays, fishing was as important as agriculture. Fishermen used advanced techniques including traps, hooks, nets, and even rudimentary forms of poisoning. Crafts and manufacturing. Different barangays specialized in different crafts. Some areas became known for excellent pottery, others for fine textiles, still others for weapon making. These goods were traded between communities. Trade, inter-barangay trade, and trade with foreign merchants formed an important part of the economy. The Datu often received a portion of trade profits and used this wealth to strengthen his position. Raiding, warfare, and raiding were economically important. Successful raids brought not only prestige to the warrior, but also wealth in the form of captives who could be enslaved or ransomed, as well as goods and livestock. Religion and spirituality. In the barangay, pre-colonial Filipino spirituality was animistic, meaning that Filipinos believed that spirits inhabited natural phenomena. Trees, rocks, rivers, mountains, and animals all had spiritual significance. Key religious figures and beliefs included Babaylan, shamans. These were spiritual practitioners, often, though not exclusively female, who served as healers, diviners, and mediators between the physical and spiritual worlds. Babaylans used herbal medicine, performed rituals, and consulted spirits to heal illness and address community problems. They held significant social status and were often consulted on matters of importance. Diwata. These were spirits of nature, powerful beings that inhabited forests, mountains, waters, and other natural features. Diwatas were generally benevolent, but needed to be respected through proper offerings and rituals. Bathala. Different regions had different names for the supreme creator deity. In some areas, this deity was called Bathala. In others, Kabunian, Makapatag, or other names depending on regional traditions. Anitos. These were the spirits of ancestors who could influence the living world. Proper rituals and offerings to Anitos were essential to maintain family health and prosperity. Rituals and ceremonies. Barangay communities held elaborate rituals for planting and harvesting seasons, coming-of-age ceremonies, marriage ceremonies, and death rites. These ceremonies reinforced community bonds and connected the people to the spiritual realm. Daily life in the barangay. The daily life of a typical barangay resident would have involved, for farmers, rising before dawn to tend rice paddies, maintaining irrigation systems, and preparing fields for planting and harvest. The work was hard but regulated by seasonal patterns that had been refined over centuries. For fishermen, constructing and maintaining fishing equipment, going out to sea, and processing the catch for food or trade. For craftspeople, producing specialized goods, whether pottery, textiles, metalwork, or other crafts, selling these goods within the barangay or trading them with other communities. For warriors, training in combat, participating in raids, or defending the barangay against threats. For women, managing household affairs, growing vegetables in gardens near the home, processing foods, producing textiles through weaving, and bearing and raising children. For children, learning the skills they would need as adults through observation and participation, playing games, and gradually taking on more responsibilities. Inter-barangay relations and early confederation. While each barangay was autonomous, they did not exist in isolation. Over time, relationships developed between neighboring barangays. Trade relationships. Barangays that produced different goods would establish regular trade relationships, with merchant families maintaining long-term partnerships. Section 3. The influence of Hindu-Buddhist kingdoms, 900 CE to 1400 CE. The Sri Vijaya connection. Around the 9th century CE, the Philippines began experiencing increasing cultural and economic influence from one of the greatest maritime empires of Southeast Asia, the Sri Vijaya Empire, centered in what is now Sumatra and Malaysia. This influence didn't come through military conquest, but through trade, marriage alliances, and cultural diffusion. The Sri Vijaya Empire was a Buddhist maritime trading empire that controlled vast stretches of Southeast Asian waters and extensive trade networks. Sri Vijayan merchants and navigators were among the most sophisticated seafarers of their time. They maintained trading posts throughout Southeast Asia and the Indian Ocean, and their influence extended throughout the maritime world, including the Philippines. Evidence of Sri Vijayan influence in pre-colonial Philippines. Archaeological evidence shows that by the 9th and 10th centuries, Sanskrit inscriptions began to appear in the Philippines. The famous Laguna copperplate inscription, dating to around 900 CE, is written in Old Tagalog, but uses the Baybayin script, a Sanskrit-derived writing system, and mentions several Sanskrit terms and titles. This inscription documents a debt settlement and mentions various titles including Datu, Lakan, and Dansalan, showing that Sanskrit-influenced titles and administrative concepts were being adopted in the Philippines. Sri Vijayan influence brought several important cultural elements. Writing systems. The Baybayin script that was used throughout the Philippines derives from Sanskrit-based scripts used in Sri Vijaya. This writing system was used for everything from business records to religious texts. Administrative concepts. Sanskrit-derived titles and administrative structures began to influence Philippine leadership. The term Datu itself, while of disputed origin, became more standardized, partly through this Sanskrit-influenced period. Religious syncretism. While the Philippines never fully converted to Buddhism, Buddhist concepts and practices were incorporated into existing animistic beliefs, creating a syncretic religious worldview that incorporated elements of both traditions, artistic and architectural styles. Sri Vijayan influence brought new artistic styles in sculpture, metalwork, and textile design. Archaeological finds show evidence of Sri Vijayan-influenced artwork in the Philippines. Commercial sophistication. Sri Vijayan traders brought more sophisticated commercial practices, and Philippine merchants adopted many of these techniques, expanding their own trading networks and accumulating wealth that increased their social status. The Majapahit Empire and its Philippine territories. As Sri Vijaya declined in the 13th century, another great maritime empire rose to prominence. The Majapahit Empire centered on Java. The Majapahit was even larger and more powerful than Sri Vijaya, and its influence over the Philippines was correspondingly greater. The Majapahit Empire, founded in 1293 CE, was at the height of its power in the 14th and 15th centuries. At its peak, the Majapahit controlled an empire that stretched from the Philippines in the east to Sumatra and Malaya in the west. Unlike Sri Vijaya, which was primarily a maritime trading network, Majapahit was a territorial empire with direct control over conquered regions. Majapahit's Philippine territories. The evidence for Majapahit control in the Philippines is less direct than some Southeast Asian scholars would like, but several pieces of evidence suggest significant influence. The Mindanao evidence. Spanish accounts mention that when they arrived in the 16th century, the Sultanate of Maguindanao, which was established later, claimed descent from Majapahit royalty. Archaeological evidence. Certain architectural styles and artistic traditions found in the Philippines show clear Majapahit influences. Linguistic evidence. Certain terms and concepts in Philippine languages show Javanese or Majapahit influences. Trade records. Majapahit court records mention tributary relationships with Philippine territories, though the extent of actual control is debated. Religious and cultural influence. Majapahit brought greater Hindu-Buddhist syncretism, and ideas from Javanese culture permeated throughout the islands. The Indianized Philippine kingdoms. The influence of Hindu-Buddhist empires like Sri Vijaya and Majapahit led to the development of several Indianized kingdoms in the Philippines by the 14th and 15th centuries. The Rajahnate of Cebu. One of the most important was the Rajahnate of Cebu, which emerged in the 12th to 13th centuries as a major maritime power. By the time of Magellan's arrival in 1521, Cebu was one of the most prominent Rajahnates in the Visayas, Central Philippines. The Raja of Cebu controlled extensive trade networks and maintained tribute relationships with neighboring Rajahnates. The Rajahnate of Cebu's government was influenced by Hindu-Buddhist concepts of kingship brought through Majapahit and other Southeast Asian empires. The Raja was seen not merely as a Datu who led a single barangay, but as a king who ruled over multiple communities and controlled extensive territory. The Rajahnate of Butuan. On Mindanao's northern coast, the Rajahnate of Butuan emerged as another important maritime power, also with Hindu-Buddhist influences visible in its structure and practices. The kingdoms of Western Luzon and Mindanao, various other Rajahnates and sultanates developed, each controlling significant territory and engaging in extensive trade. Hindu-Buddhist elements in pre-colonial Philippine culture. The Hindu-Buddhist influence brought to the Philippines through Sri Vijaya and Majapahit resulted in syncretism. Rather than replacing the indigenous animism, Hindu-Buddhist concepts were incorporated into the existing belief system. Dewata, spirits, came to be understood as similar to Hindu deities, and the supreme creator, deity Bathala, was conceptualized in ways reminiscent of Hindu theology. Section 4. Islam and the Transformation of the South, 1400 CE to 1521 CE. The Islamic missionary movements. While the Hindu-Buddhist influences were transforming the northern and central Philippines, a new religious force was reshaping the southern islands, Islam. Beginning in the 14th century and accelerating through the 15th century, Islamic missionary movements from Malaysia, Brunei, and the Middle East brought Islam to the Philippines. The early spread of Islam in Mindanao and Sulu. The first Muslim teachers to arrive in the southern Philippines were likely merchants and Sufis, Islamic mystics, who came through maritime trade routes. Unlike the forceful conversion campaigns that would later characterize Spanish colonization, Islamic conversion in the pre-colonial Philippines was gradual and often voluntary. Merchants, traders, and spiritual leaders came from Muslim kingdoms in Malaysia and Brunei, and they converted local rulers and their followers to Islam. Key figures in Philippine Islamization. Sharif Kabungsuan. According to Philippine Islamic tradition, Sharif Kabungsuan was an Arab missionary who arrived in Mindanao in the 15th century. Some accounts place him in the 13th century, though 15th century is more historically supported. Kabungsuan established the Sultanate of Maguindanao and married into the local ruling family, establishing a dynasty that would rule Maguindanao for centuries. Through his work, Islam became firmly established in central Mindanao. Sharif Abubakar. Another important Islamic missionary figure, Sharif Abubakar helped establish Islam in the Sulu Archipelago. He founded the Sultanate of Sulu and established himself as the first Sultan of Sulu, creating a powerful Islamic state that would rival Christian Cebu in power and influence. Local rulers who embraced Islam. Many local datus and rajas embraced Islam not through forced conversion, but because Islam offered a sophisticated religious and political framework. Islamic law provided a legal code more complex and detailed than the customary law of the barangays. Islamic political thought provided models of kingship and empire that elevated their status. The Sultanates of Mindanao and Sulu. By the time Magellan arrived in 1521, Islam had been transforming the southern Philippines for over a century. Two major sultanates had emerged. The Sultanate of Maguindanao. The Sultanate of Maguindanao, founded by Sharif Kabungsuan, controlled the fertile lands of central Mindanao and was one of the most powerful states in the pre-colonial Philippines. The Sultanate controlled extensive rice-producing agricultural lands, valuable spice-growing regions, access to trade routes connecting Southeast Asia with the Indian Ocean, a strong navy capable of challenging Portuguese traders who would later attempt to establish dominance in Southeast Asia. The Sultan of Maguindanao maintained a court that rivaled those of the Rajanates of the Visayas in sophistication and wealth. The Sultanate had a bureaucratic system based on Islamic principles, with officials appointed to handle various aspects of government, including war, religion, law, and trade. The Sultanate of Sulu. The Sultanate of Sulu, founded by Sharif Abubakar and ruled by a succession of sultans, controlled the Sulu Archipelago, the chain of islands between Mindanao and Sabah in present-day Malaysia. The Sulu Sultanate was perhaps even more powerful than Maguindanao in military terms, maintaining a large pirate fleet, which the Spanish would later call Moros, that controlled maritime trade in the region. The Sulu Sultanate maintained tributary relationships with neighboring regions, and engaged in extensive trade with China, Southeast Asian kingdoms, and Arab traders. The Sultanate's wealth was legendary, and sultans maintained courts of considerable splendor.